You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Welcome back to Business of Drinks. I'm Erica Ducey, and today's episode is supported by MHW Limited, a company that's been shaping the beverage alcohol landscape since 1995. MHW is a nationally licensed importer, distributor, and service provider with a footprint that's incredibly rare in the drinks industry. They hold licenses in all 50 states and across the EU. This reach allows them to serve as the global back office partner for both established brands and new founders in wine, spirits, beer, RTDs, and non-alc. They work with suppliers from more than 90 countries, and they handle the operational complexities that make this industry so challenging. National wholesale fulfillment, distributor order fulfillment in New York, New Jersey, California, and Florida, plus logistics, compliance, reporting, and accounting. It's a lot. And this year marks MHW's 30th anniversary, and they're celebrating with some major expansions. They've introduced cost-effective a la carte, outsourced compliance and license management services for brands that maintain their own permits. And they've broadened their support for new and emerging products with Brand Arc, their brand development and creative design program. In recent years, MHW has also strengthened its wine capabilities through the acquisitions of USA Wine West and USA Wine Imports, giving them the ability to support wine brands of every shape and size in both the US and the EU. It's a unique model in a highly complex market, and today we're going to dive into how it works, what makes it so efficient and effective, and why so many high-growth beverage companies rely on MHW as the operational engine behind their businesses. So today we're joined by three leaders from the company: Ryan O'Hara, MHW's Chief Executive Officer; Scott Saul, the company's Executive Vice President; and Marianne Pisani, Senior Advisory Consultant, who is formerly MHW's Chief Revenue Officer. So welcome, everyone, and congratulations on MHW's 30th anniversary.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, we're excited to have you here, and let's start out with a round of introductions. Ryan, why don't you start?
Thanks, Erica. Really excited to be here and have this conversation with you. So for my background, I joined MHW in 2018. And prior to that, I spent my whole career in financial services doing a host of different things. And these two individuals, Scott and Marianne, when I joined, were really the two mentors that helped me, get up that steep learning curve of all the complexities with beverage alcohol. And it's been a fun ride since, and transition from, really having a focus on the finance leadership into the seat that I am today.
That's great. Scott, tell us about you.
So, Erica, it's a pleasure to be with you today. As you mentioned, I'm the Executive Vice President. I joined MHW in January 2nd of 1997, so I'm coming up on 29 years. I am employee number 2 here at MHW. My background is solely in beverage alcohol, so I am in the industry, I would say now 46 years. At MHW, I oversee all compliance and regulatory matters. Again, I am not an attorney, but that has been my role here since day one.
Great. And Marianne, tell us about you.
Yes. Well, thanks for having us. And so I began at MHW 6 months after Scott in June of 97. So I too am coming up on 29 years. I have held a number of different positions throughout the company. When I began, I was employee number 5, and I was working part-time initially from home. And then I guess the first remote employee we had at that point. And so as we grew, I took on different roles. I became the Chief Operating Officer for a number of years, and then I became the Chief Revenue Officer. And last year, I decided to step back a bit and retire, and offered consulting services. And I stayed on as senior advisor consultant. And I've seen the industry develop quite a bit, as well as MHW through the years.
Wow, so we have an expert team here. Marianne, why don't you talk me through the history of MHW and how its service model has evolved?
Sure. So MHW, our licenses actually date back to 1934. And the significance of 1934 is we have some of the first licenses issued after the repeal of prohibition, which is pretty cool and, really gives us a historical value. Back then, it was a traditional importer. And through the years, it was in many different hands and many different names. And it was a company that PepsiCo owned, Monsieur Henry Wines. And it was mostly for wine importation, and PepsiCo owned them. And Richard Nixon was going over to visit Khrushchev in the former Soviet Union. And he invited his friend, the CEO of PepsiCo, to join him. There were no Western products available in the former Soviet Union at that time. He brought with him a can of Pepsi. And there's a famous picture of Khrushchev tasting the Pepsi in a paper cup with PepsiCo on it. And I guess it was 60s. He vowed to get PepsiCo concentrate into the former Soviet Union. But at the time, the ruble was worth nothing. So they had to come up with a counter trade mechanism. And what they did was PepsiCo saw that there was a call for imported vodka. Most of the vodka consumed at that time in the US was distilled in the United States. There was very little imports coming in at that time. And in their marketing wisdom, they knew they could develop it. And so the trade was a Pepsi concentrate for Stoller Schneider. And that is how Monsieur Henry kind of built. And then a number of years later, the walls came down. The trade mechanism was no longer necessary. PepsiCo sold their rights to Stoli to a company called Graham Met, which is now Diageo, one of the biggest players in the industry. And then at that point in time, they decided to divest of beverage alcohol. John Baudet, one of our founders, along with his two co-founders, were all former PepsiCo execs. John Baudet had been the CFO of Monsieur Henry Wines, and he saw what was starting to happen in the industry, a massive consolidation. First at the importer level, and he could see it was going to come at the distributor level. And that would make it more and more difficult for new brands to get into the US. And they needed some type of avenue to get into the consumer's hands in the US. So you had all these producers and you had all these consumers with interest, but you had a massive bottleneck in the middle because with less and less importers, it was harder for new brands to get in. And he came up with the concept of the service model. They purchased all the licenses from PepsiCo, as well as went out and got further licenses. You mentioned in your introduction, we have distributor licenses in a number of states. They got those, they added beer, and that's where the service model began.
That's a fascinating legacy. Well, Ryan, maybe you can talk us through the advantages that the importer service provider model offers and how the model has changed over the years.
Definitely, Erica. And, I think you did a phenomenal job talking about MHW up front. We may have to pull you and put you on the business development team, but to double click on that a little bit in terms of, advantages of the importer service model, I think the first things are just thinking about the ways that it's different from a traditional importer. And so when you think about a traditional importer partnering through that model, you're giving up a lot of that control. And there's, a certain margin and pricing that goes into that. With MHW, our focus is really on being an extension of our clients' teams that can handle all of the infrastructure needs in a really cost-effective way so you can get to the market confidently. So, we handle your logistics, order fulfillment, compliance, everything you need to get your product, all the way through the 3-tier system and on shelves. And we have a full license structure to be able to, be a turnkey platform where you can, enter into as many markets as quickly as you need to. And we can do that for brands new to market, 0 case, all the way up to existing 1 million case brands. And so some of the key advantages really is having that cost efficient expert team where we have a staff of 150 plus, where many people have 10, 20 years of experience and can make sure that everything's getting done timely and compliantly, and that's tough to do, especially if you're a smaller brand starting out, where usually you're wearing a number of different hats trying to do a bit of everything. And this is a complex regulatory framework to navigate, especially if you're a foreign brand coming in. So I'd say that expertise of the team, being able to handle all of your infrastructure needs, and then it's a cost-effective approach here when you think about what our kind of standard entry-level fees are relative to having to go out and hire. Important distinction between this model, our model, and a traditional importer is sales and marketing. That's not something that we do. And so this allows brands to really control the way that they want to go to market, to focus on their core competencies of creating that brand, telling their story, working on their customer accounts, and leaving the rest to us.
Yeah. Well, I think that most people in the industry are at least familiar with the name MHW, but they may not know the breadth of services that are offered. So, what would you say are some of the misconceptions about the company that you encounter out in the marketplace?
Well, over the last 30 years, what's been our mainstay is brand new brands, new to market, and that continues while we deal with a lot of large brands and celebrity brands and all of that. Those new to market startups are still what fuels us and what the majority of our clients are. And so one of the misconceptions that people have is because we've gotten so large over the years and have done so many recognizable brands that we're not still ready to help the small guy. And we're very much hands-on. Like Ryan mentioned, we don't do sales and marketing. We don't do it, but we certainly provide all types of assistance, whether it be referrals to brokers across the country or helping interview salespeople that they're hiring or introductions to e-commerce companies. We provide all that, a platform for them to go to trade shows with us. We do all of those things. We're just not directly out there carrying a sample bag and doing the actual selling. Some folks might say we just do compliance, but we're way more than a compliance company. It's the basis for everything we do. Being compliant, legal, and following all regulations is really the top tenet of our company. But after that, we are actually very much involved in the logistics, in the chain of title, in everything else, in all the accounting that has to do with the product and getting out there. What we tend to say is that our clients get to handle the more juicy pieces, the more exciting, and we handle the minutia that no one else wants to do, but you can't exist without.
I'd add that our model is only for supporting brands that don't have any of their own license structure, right? So you kind of need to seek out MHW to be able to find a licensed partner that will purchase product from you and sell into distributors and direct to retail in some chains. But we have a number of clients that have their own license structure built out, but there are ways for us to still assist them and be a real value add, whether you're looking at thinking about what to keep in-house versus outsource, order fulfillment and logistics, or just compliance execution, or various combinations of that. And then there are also other specific instances where more limited agreement is where we can really help small to large brands alike, whether that's with control states or other specifics, depending on the unique license structure that a brand may have.
Yeah, I mean, it is so complex. And then on top of that, by some estimates, there are 75% fewer beverage alcohol distributors than there were in the early 2000s. So, how did consolidation affect MHW's service model?
Yeah. So as I said early on, John Baudet had the vision to see that the consolidations would cause a massive backlog. That's only increased and become harder and harder for new brands and even existing brands to get attention and shelf space. So if you look at New York as just one example, when I first began in the early 2000s, there was probably somewhere between 15 and 20 major distributors. I'm not talking about small boutique distributors, major distributors that carried both wine and spirits. Beer is separate in New York. And now there really are two major ones, probably another 5 of important ones, but two major ones. So when that happens and you start combining, especially for the outlying products, not the main products, but things like a Irish cream, or perhaps back then a mezcal, or even bourbon back then. Well, how many do you need, right? Like you don't need 50. So you have to start divesting. And that has continued all the way through. Currently, there are major wholesalers who consolidate in a market like maybe Chicago, and all of a sudden they start looking at their portfolio and there's too many vodkas or too many tequilas, too many Irish whiskeys. And these brands that have volume suddenly don't have a house. So that has really helped with the growth of service models because they have volume. They know they can do it. They've got proof of concept. So, and then, some of them get a little gun shy. They don't necessarily want to go to another distributor who could do the same thing. When I say national distributor, you have to have an in-state distributor, but they look to us so they can have a little bit more, as Ryan pointed out, control and management of where the brand is going and what type of development it'll have. And that continues. The consolidations haven't ended. They do continue. Every once in a while, a few new ones pop up, but still for the major ones, they're still consolidating. We still don't know where it will all flush out, but it's definitely been a positive for us for both new brands and existing brands development.
Great. And Scott, the service model really has worked so well for MHW clients. And now other companies have picked up the framework after seeing how well it performed. So, what are some of the additional ways that MHW has championed and supported the beverage alcohol industry over the years?
So, given our position in the industry, we've become a member of the Distilled Spirits Council. So we have a seat at the table with some of the biggest companies in the industry, like Constellation Brands, Brown-Forman, Moet Hennessy. So we're always at the forefront and working with these groups. And also, so Ryan is on the board. I'm his backup on that board. We also belong to the National Association of Beverage Importers. At this point, I am the chairman of the National Association of Beverage Importers. So we work closely with the TTB on some regulatory and compliance related matters. So going back years ago, when there was a working group with the TTB on allowable revisions, on label revisions, so you don't have to get a new cola, I was part of that working group that came up with all the list of allowable revisions. As a member of these two groups, we also work closely with the government on the Craft Beverage Modernization Act, which was temporary at one point for only 2 years. And working with both those groups, we were able to get that passed on a permanent basis. And that is the lowering of the federal excise tax on distilled spirits, on wine, and on beer, which was a significant savings for the industry.
Scott, I would just add to that on top of, how we, are champions for the industry in terms of our industry groups and the presence there. One thing that I love about the beverage alcohol industry overall and MHW's business is the innovation, right? And so we've seen the craft spirit movement and craft beer and the just, increase in wineries, domestically. And the consumer is constantly looking for something interesting, exciting, fun, authentic. And we see so much evolution in product being a partner to so many new to market brands, and that is always really participating at the forefront of trends as they're happening. We love being able to partner with growing brands and experience some of that innovation that is just really foundational for the industry.
And to add to that, we were the importer of the very first absinthe when it first became legal, the brand Lucid. So we were the importer of record for that. Obviously, the supplier did a lot of work with the TTB, but we were the importer of Lucid. We're also involved in the category for many, many years. Cachaça was labeled as Brazilian rum. Eventually, through some trade agreements with Brazil, cachaça became a category. So we were the importer of a major cachaça at the time as well. So to add to Ryan's point about being at the forefront of innovation, we were involved in a lot of these brands when they first came to market.
One more that comes to mind is mezcal. So today, mezcal is very well known. It wasn't 20 years ago, not at all. And the Mexican government actually came to us and asked us if we would do a program in New York, an educational program to teach people about mezcal. We created a website. We imported mezcal from 10 different suppliers. In this program, we had someone who went out and did educational forums, tastings, all kinds of events all over New York for a year. And of those 10 brands who had never been in the US before, who only initially sent in like 2 pallets, 100 and something cases each, 6 of those brands remained in the US. A couple of them were bought by major players like Diageo as the years went on. So that was a really exciting thing to be on the ground floor of. People who never heard of it, never experienced mezcal, who were tequila drinkers, because that's where all the appeal went to Mexican restaurants and things like that. And then we were supposed to do it again on the West Coast, but unfortunately, the program that supported it on the Mexican side ran out of funds, so we couldn't. But that was a really exciting thing to be part of and on the ground floor of.
Yeah, absolutely. And to look a little bit more at innovation, I'm curious to know, you've had a front row seat to understand how it has changed over the years to bring beverage alcohol brands to market. So, can you paint a picture of what it was like to start and manage a Bev Alc brand 30 years ago versus today?
So the one thing that remains constant is having to get liquid to lips, right? You've got to get people to taste. Beverage alcohol is not something that sells, through an ad in the paper or something. It really needs to be tasted and seen and experienced. So that doesn't change, but it's how that's happened over the years. So when we first began, we were very manual. Our clients were very manual. And one of our favorite stories from the early days was a product called Hypnotic. It was a French liqueur with cognac, and it was a bluish green, a little bit thick. And it initially, Scott and I were like, oh, I don't know, blue, who's drinking something blue, right? Well, the gentleman who began the product was going out and selling every day in Manhattan, and he was selling it literally bottle by bottle. Today, we have a CRD, which is our client reporting dashboard, where our clients have complete transparency into everything we do. But at that point in time, we had not developed that yet. And he would literally come to the office every afternoon and say, how many bottles did I sell yesterday? And everyone will go and look at the reports, and you sold 10, you sold 9. Wow, you had a good day. You sold 13, and we thought like, oh my gosh, like how long can this guy sustain this? Well, next thing you know, Puff Daddy sang about it and it became huge. And so then instead of how many bottles did I sell, it was how many containers did I sell each day? And it went on to be sold to, at the time, it went to Heaven Hill. So that gentleman, basically had the last laugh on, the millions that he made from that. But that is very much what the landscape looked like. It was a very manual. We didn't have all the data we have today and all the ways to find out who is that consumer buying your product. The only way you found it out by having someone on the ground talking to people, right? So while tastings and all of those things are still very popular, people can run a smarter business with data and different bits of information that they can attain, and they can do social media engagement with folks. It's not just advertising on social media, but getting people engaged, getting them involved in going somewhere and tasting a new cocktail that was just put on a cocktail menu, things like that. That wasn't available back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So everything was done. We had salespeople calling in orders, like as they were driving through the tunnel. Everything was very manual. And you'd be like, did you say red or white? You didn't want to get the order wrong, but everything was, we were faxing things to the warehouse. And when the fax machine went down, we were literally calling and someone on the other end was writing it down. Now everything is electronic and everything's transmitted. So there's just been so many major developments over the years. And the innovation, something like Hypnotic, was new and different, but there wasn't a whole lot of innovation in the late 90s. Early 2000s, it really started to come, the flavored vodkas and various things like that. The getting a little bit away from the wine coolers and starting some RTDs with a spirit base. That was that initial innovation trend that began and has just continued and made that consumer so anxious for the new and the different.
And to add a little bit to that, back in the day, not everybody had the benefit of getting their product in a rap song. And back in the day, there was, I would say, no real celebrity brands, which now there's quite a few celebrity brands. So back in the day, that didn't exist. That has changed over the years, for sure.
Brands also were signing very long agreements with traditional importers. And sometimes when they wanted to take that brand back, they needed to do it quickly when there was a moment in the contract that allowed them to do that. And that also was a way that we became valuable because we had the platform. So they could plug into our platform of 50 state accessibility and not have to go out and get all the licenses immediately. And one of our favorite stories is Proximo. That was 1800 tequila and 3 vodka. And they called us on a cold call. Just we didn't have a marketing department or a sales department at the time. It was myself, Scott, and John Bodette, the president, who did all the sales. And they called in and I'm taking the call and they're asking me all these questions. And I couldn't get Scott on the intercom. So I kept running up the stairs to where his office was and asking him the questions because they were compliance questions. But I had no idea who I was talking to. And I was on the phone for like 2 hours. And finally, at the end of the call, he said, could you send me this, this, and this via email? And I said, sure. And he gave me his email address. And his email address was his name at josecuervo.com. And like, I almost fainted. I was like, I went running back up the stairs and I said, I've been talking to Jose Cuervo for 2 hours. Maybe they're coming, but they weren't bringing us Jose Cuervo, unfortunately, but they were preparing for when their contract was up with Diageo to take Jose Cuervo in-house. So they needed us to do the Proximo. Then they bought 3 vodka and for us to do that. So we were able to gear up and be ready to do a 2 million case brand in a couple of months. And there's no way that someone starting fresh could do that themselves and eventually then assisting them in getting their own licenses so they would have the platform for Jose Cuervo when those 6 million cases came. And until Jose Cuervo came, they felt we were very close with a number of people there that it was more economical to use us than to do it themselves until they got, into like the 10 million category.
That's fascinating. I mean, there's just so many different brand applications here and use cases and case studies that I'm sure we can talk about all day. One thing I did want to touch on is the compliance question. So, Scott, I know you're the #2 employee veteran of the company. We talked a little bit about importing absinthe and the class designation for cachaça. What are some of the other unique compliance situations where MHW has actually made history in the industry?
Well, aside from the cachaça and the absinthe, given the innovation that we've been involved with, we've come across products, suppliers want to introduce products that are very, very unique. So if we go back to a particular client that their product was literally distilled from pine cones. For a product like that, you have to submit it to the TTB. And the TTB literally called us after we submitted the formula and really wanted to double check, is this product really distilled from pine cones? Said, yes, it is. And they go like, what's next? You're going to distill 57 Chevy? They hadn't seen anything like it either. We're known to submit things that nobody else has submitted. They're some very, very unique products. Some I've mentioned, some we cannot mention because we wouldn't even decide to submit it to the TTB because it was so out of the realm of possibility of even getting it approved. So those are some of the things we're involved in. And obviously with FDA we're involved in FDA also because all the ingredients used in a beverage alcohol, flavors have to be FDA approved as well. So we've been involved in when people come out with a new gin and one of their botanicals is derived from the root at the bottom of the Amazon River, we first have to check if it's FDA approved. And a lot of times it's not. We don't actually submit flavorings to the FDA, but we work closely with our clients and the FDA to make sure all the ingredients are FDA, what's called GRAS, generally recognized as safe. So there's always the uniqueness of it. People want to set themselves apart from the competition to come up with new and exciting brands, but not all of them can get to market right away without the proper approval from both FDA and TTB.
Yeah. And I also wanted to touch on M&A activity. I know there has been a lot of it that has transpired under the MHW roof. Can you tell me about some of those stories?
Yeah, there has been a lot. And I think we talked about, Hypnotic, which was our first one, which was really exciting. But over the years, there's been many. And Casamigas stands out as one of the ones that was a very unique situation. So they were imported by Sidney Frank, which was a major importer at the time. And Sidney Frank sold to Jägermeister. And when Jaeger purchased Sidney Frank, they decided to divest of all the alcohol brands except for Jaeger and concentrate on building Jaeger back into the powerhouse it had been. So Casamigos, although they were very successful, were left without a home. And they were certainly on the route to acquisition. So the thought of going out, getting all their own licenses and doing all this was not appealing. And they came to us and became a brand within MHW. A number of years later, Diageo made a very dazzling offer and purchased them. And what was really interesting is Diageo said, just stay there, just stay there for a while. And we kept them for, I think, 3 years. And we continued to operate and do all the things we had done before. And then at a certain point, due to production and other things, Diageo took them in-house. So even sometimes the larger companies, while they might invest in our brands, they aren't necessarily ready to take them in-house because they really don't want to deal with the heavy lift. They're the ones who are going to take them from here to infinity. But that beginning stage is something they want to leave to our clients, and where our clients have a great opportunity to do that with a service provider. Gentlemen, any that come to mind that you want to make sure we don't leave out?
I'd say, a more recent example would just be Blue Chair Bay Rum. Kenny Chesney's rum, longtime client of MHW's, and Next Century Spirits invested in that brand, and also another MHW client. And that's one of the more recent ones that come to mind. But there's been several, and as Marianne hit on, especially if you have a brand and a playbook where that is the goal. This is something that we know how to execute. Oftentimes, if a brand's getting purchased, by one of the large players, then that eventually gets brought under their umbrella. But that's a natural kind of evolution in terms of partnerships that we have. And, we're still excited and happy to really help grow and reach its goals. And it's a great story, right? It continues to build that interest in the space when people see successful outcomes.
Yeah, Avion Tequila would be a good example of that, Marianne. If you want to tell the story about how they came to us without being able to tell us too much about the launch.
So Avion was a tequila that was begun by a gentleman who had a private jet company. So he came to us with a very interesting bottle idea, packaging idea, and this tequila. And he said, I'm going to have an opportunity with product placement in a show, but I can't tell you what the show is. And I have no poetic license. They're going to use the product how they want to use it. They're not like paying him for it. They're just going to write it into the story, actually. So the product was Avion Tequila, and the show was Entourage, if you're an HBO buff. And when they went live on Entourage, so none of us knew. We used to watch it with our children who were in their 20s at the time. And the phone rang off the hook that night with all of my children's friends saying, does your mother know how we can get this product? Because they actually wrote it in that they were developing this brand. And it was only available, I think, in under 5 states when they went live. And we'd never had anything like this happen. When we came into work the next day, the show used to air on Sunday evenings. And on Monday morning, the phones were lighting up with distributors across the country. How do I get it? How do I get it? And it was really very exciting because, that's not usually what happens when a brand comes out. They're dying for a distributor to call up and say, I want this, right? And then after a couple of years, they were purchased by Pernod.
Yeah, it was Pernod. The interesting thing was a lot of people thought it was a fake brand because it was just written into a show. They never thought it was real. Some people, obviously distributors knew, but other people, consumers, they thought it was just something part of a TV show.
They used it throughout the season, so it just kept hitting everyone, Avion, Avion, Avion. And they were great at their marketing. They blanketed the New York subways with those overhead signs and were in the front window of every retail store. So they really did an amazing job cashing in on the Entourage placement. Like we've had many clients get a paid placement, where you just kind of get a glimpse of the product, but this is the only one that was actually in the show.
Yeah, I remember that plot line in the show. And then, yes, suddenly you did start to see the brand everywhere, and it was sort of surprising at first, but that's so fun to understand MHW's role in shaping cultural history as well. So, Ryan, why don't you start to wrap us up? Tell us what's ahead for MHW.
Yeah, sure. So we've done a lot of kind of looking back and talking about what's happened with the model from the start over the last 30 years. And we continue to find ways to innovate and find new opportunities to help our partners in the market. And there's really a few things that, probably over the last 5, 6 years, we really developed organically by finding needs in the marketplace. One I'll highlight is our service called Brand Arc. So, this creates really it came out of two things. We had an individual join our team, Ian Perez, and he just had a phenomenal background in the supply chain, and was really able to help a lot of our clients in a number of areas on some things that we don't directly touch. And then just a lot of the challenges that came out of the real super cycle from the pandemic when we saw so many supply chain disruptions. And so Brand Arc developed organically, and it focuses on that critical path of getting an idea, a concept, into a finished product and brand to get to market. And so helping with product concept and design development, looking at all of your sourcing, whether that's for liquid or components, and co-packing, and really just taking an expert professional approach and optimizing that supply chain management, finding ways to get economies of scale when you're thinking about sourcing, bringing robust forecasting for inventory management and raw goods. And so that has really grown a ton. We've had dozens of projects, and that's with new emerging brand new brands, all the way up to working with some of the larger suppliers out there, helping them to be efficient when they're thinking about their innovation. So it's been a really exciting and fun development for us at MHW. Another area I'd touch on is our EU and UK services. This is probably first ideation really we started to dip our toes in was end of 2018 through 2019, got it going, and then pandemic hit, and then you're like, all right, well, maybe we'll see how all this shakes out. But today we have a platform and a model to help brands be able to sell into the EU and the UK, and a full logistics, partnerships and ability to execute there. And so again, that's an opportunity that really makes it easy and turnkey for brands that have some real market opportunity in the EU and UK. And then, a couple other things that we've been focused on are compliance execution services, or compliance as a service. That has really come up a lot more, and it can be niche, kind of one-off. Hey, I don't have the team and I need to go and register my brands, or deal with this renewal, or handling compliance execution fully outsourced for an entire team when you're thinking about everyone's searching for margin right now and what makes most sense. And it's difficult to manage compliance all the way through and have the expertise on staff and maintain that talent. So we've seen a lot of growth there. And probably the last one I'd highlight here is, private and control label. And so we have programs where we help, large retailers as they're looking to establish their private label or control label programs, and can do that really soup to nuts, whether that's from product sourcing all the way through to importing and compliance and execution. That's been a really great opportunity to continue to grow with what we're seeing as a trend in the marketplace.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place for us to conclude. We have gotten so much detail about MHW and its unique legacy and role in the industry. For people to learn more, where should they go?
Our website, www.mhwltd.com, and that will provide a ton of information. And there's ways to set up an appointment with one of our team to provide even further information.
Fantastic. Well, Ryan, Scott, and Marianne, thank you so much for joining us on Business of Drinks. This has been such an interesting conversation. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Thank you for having us, Erica. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for joining us on Business of Drinks. Subscribe on YouTube at Business of Drinks Podcast. Follow us on Spotify, or listen in on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. please tap the notification button so you'll be the first to know when a new episode drops.
And help us spread the word. Click those star ratings, give us a review, and share episodes or clips on your socials. It really helps us reach new listeners.
Finally, if there's something that you'd like us to cover on the podcast, tell us. We're at podcast@businessofdrinks.com or reach out via Instagram or LinkedIn.
We love hearing from you and we respond to each and every message. Thanks and see you next time.